Every time a global crisis happens, something strange appears alongside the fear. Attention. Millions of people suddenly refresh the news every few minutes. They watch videos, read comments, follow every update. And most people tell themselves the same thing. I just want to stay informed. But psychology suggests something far more uncomfortable. For some people, crisis doesn't just trigger anxiety. It triggers fascination. And the real reason might not be what people want to admit. Because when psychologists study human behavior during major global events, they often see a few predictable psychological reactions. Let's start with the first one. One of the strongest psychological responses to crisis is the need for control. When uncertainty rises, the brain becomes extremely uncomfortable. Humans are wired to predict what happens next. But crisis destroys predictability. So the brain looks for another way to feel in control. And this is where constant news checking begins. Refreshing the feed, watching another update, reading another thread. Each new piece of information creates a small psychological relief, even if the information changes nothing about your situation. Because the brain interprets information as preparation, and preparation feels like control. But control isn't the only reason people become absorbed in crisis. There's another psychological force at work. Crisis activates the brain's threat system, the same biological system that reacts to danger. Your body releases adrenaline, your attention sharpens, your senses become more alert. And that heightened state can become strangely stimulating. It's the same reason people watch disaster movies, true crime stories, or survival documentaries. Fear and fascination begin to overlap. Your brain enters a state of intense focus, and that intensity can make people keep watching, even when the content is disturbing. But adrenaline alone doesn't explain something else we see during crisis. Something even more interesting happens when people start discussing these events with others. Crisis doesn't just capture attention, it creates identity. When major global events unfold, people rarely remain neutral observers. Instead, they begin positioning themselves within the story. They ask, what do I believe? Who do I agree with? Where do I stand? And once people adopt a position, the crisis becomes something more than news. It becomes part of how they define themselves. They join discussions, groups, and communities that reinforce their viewpoint. And suddenly, the crisis isn't just something happening in the world. It becomes something happening within social identity. But once identity becomes involved, another psychological pattern usually appears. Crisis creates opportunities for people to judge behavior, not just the behavior of leaders or governments, but the behavior of each other. People start evaluating how others react. Who seems informed? Who seems insensitive? Who seems wrong? And this evaluation creates something subtle but powerful, a sense of moral comparison. When people believe their reaction is the correct one, they feel a form of psychological certainty. That certainty can be surprisingly rewarding, even when the situation itself is tragic. But not everyone reacts by arguing or positioning themselves in the conversation. Some people respond in a completely different way. Some individuals observe crisis almost like spectators. They analyze the strategy, the history, the political consequences. Their reaction appears calm and analytical. This can look like intellectual curiosity, but sometimes it's also psychological distance. When the brain feels overwhelmed by emotion, it protects itself by shifting into analysis. Instead of feeling the situation emotionally, the mind turns it into something abstract, almost like watching a documentary rather than experiencing a real event. And that distance can make people appear strangely detached from something deeply serious. When you step back and look at these reactions together, something interesting becomes clear. Crisis doesn't just reveal events. It reveals psychology. It shows how people deal with fear, how they handle uncertainty, how they search for control, identity, and certainty when the world suddenly becomes unpredictable. None of these reactions mean someone is cruel or insensitive. They mean the human mind is trying to process something overwhelming. But once you start noticing these patterns in others and in yourself, you begin to see crisis differently. Not just as a series of events, but as a mirror that reveals how human psychology behaves when the world becomes unstable. The uncomfortable truth is that global events don't only expose political realities, they expose psychological ones. And the way people react during moments like this often says far more about human nature than the event themselves. Follow for more psychology like this.